Okay, so welcome to the start of this video series. Hopefully from the introduction video you've got a better idea of the journey that I'm going to take you on with these videos. And like I explained in the intro video, it's not just for the youth athlete to take note of, it's also for the parent of someone who may be involved in kind of activity, sport, high level sport, anywhere on the spectrum, and to get a better idea of how they can contribute to obviously developing that specific athlete. And again, this isn't exactly directed at those involved in high level sport, as this sort of information is applicable and accessible to athletes of all levels, all sports, and let's get cracking into it. Okay, so this first video is going to introduce you to a host of different terms and the terminology that is quite commonly used in a gym environment but may not be known to you. And the whole idea is that once you know, or that you are aware of these words, then the programming or the kind of getting involved in a gym environment isn't as daunting or as scary, because then you have a better understanding of what it is that you're being asked to do, and it makes it a little bit easier to follow. And don't worry if you don't get them the first time, because obviously you can rewind the video, but each one, as the series goes on, we'll delve into it a little bit more detail. So at some point we will go into detail in each one of them, whereas now I just want to give you kind of a brief overview of what it means and what it's going to mean for the rest of the series as well. Some of these will be extremely basic, while some of them will be a little bit more complex, but again, don't worry if you don't get them the first time. Depending on where you are in your journey, some of them may not apply to you immediately, but somewhere down the road you will need to kind of have a basic understanding, especially as a parent or a coach of someone involved in sport. Having an understanding of these will make it easier for you to have a positive impact on their journey, as you're probably going to have a obviously larger contact time and more of an influence over their development long term. Starting at a very basic level, we've got a repetition, and it's one of those words that pops up in every program, in every session. You're always asked, oh, how many do I do? And the answer you get is X amount of reps. And the repetition is simply the amount of times that you need to perform an exercise. So that might be one squat, one push-up, one jump, whatever it is. It's one full repetition of an exercise, and that makes up the foundation then of the rest of the program. So once you get a block of reps, it becomes a set. So you might have one set of 10 reps, and then that's just a collection of a prescribed set of repetitions for a given exercise. So you might have, again, quite typically it's 3 sets of 8 reps, which is written by 3 by 8 in a program. So 3 sets of 8, which means you do 8, you'll have a little bit of a rest, you do another 8, a rest, and then a final set of 8, and then you move on to the next exercise. Exercise mechanics then is one of those ones where it's not really commonly used, but sometimes it pops up when people are talking about it. And what it means is when a coach is going into a little bit more detail about how an exercise is actually either performed, how it works, what it works to do, what it benefits. And it's when someone asks the question, oh, what does this do? And then you kind of try and break it down for someone to give them a better understanding of what it's about. Now, to give you a little bit of context around it, each exercise is broken down into kind of 3 sections. So you've got an eccentric portion, an isometric portion, and a concentric portion. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in each of those. Each portion of an exercise, ideally the muscle will be doing some sort of work. So in the eccentric portion, what we're talking about is when a muscle is getting longer, but it's also at the same time producing some force. So it'd be the difference between if you were holding up a box and you just decided to let the box drop really fast, as opposed to holding the box and letting it down slowly towards the floor. That would be an idea or an example of kind of an eccentric focused lift. To make it a little bit easier, if you're thinking about a bicep curl, obviously I'm going to show you this, but I don't have any biceps, so it mightn't make sense. Okay, so when we think about our arms like this, you've got a bicep which connects from here to here, and say if I want to eccentrically contract my bicep, I'm going to make it longer, so going from here to here, that is eccentric lengthening of the muscle. The isometric portion then would be when it doesn't change length, so it stays the same length but we're still contracting against it. So if I had a dumbbell out here and I'm contracting against it but the muscle doesn't get shorter or longer and I'm just holding that there, that would be considered the isometric contraction. And then the concentric contraction is when the muscle is getting shorter, again producing force. So when I'm pulling the dumbbell from here into here, and then we shorten that bicep, and then that's your concentric contraction. So again, each exercise will have its own unique eccentric, isometric and concentric portions of an exercise, but the whole idea is that you're aware of these terms. You don't need to know each individual portion of each exercise, because again, that's not overly important for you until you get to an advanced stage of training where when you're trying to manipulate certain things, it helps to know these things. But as long as you have a basic understanding of that, that's all we're looking for. Obviously, whenever you see rest on a program, that is quite simply you rest. Sometimes you might just have a passive rest where you're just sitting down, resting for a certain amount of time, whether that's 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Sometimes you'll have active rest, so in an active rest you're resting from the exercise but you're also combining some sort of activity into that rest. So for example, if you were doing squats and you were doing 3 sets of 8 on squats, but in your rest time you were doing some sort of a balance exercise, that would be considered active rest, because the exercise itself isn't overly taxing, but you are getting some work done. Moving on to the next one then is the word hypertrophy. So a lot of times we talk things like strength, power, speed, agility, and a lot of people kind of understand what those words mean. I'll obviously explain them in a little bit more detail anyway. One of the ones where a lot of times it's not really a focus of a program for an athlete unless it's in the off season, and that's hypertrophy. And what we mean by that is kind of just like getting bigger. And as a youth athlete, it's something that you're not really focused on until the latter stages of adolescence, because obviously when you're pre-puberty, you're not gonna have the means physiologically to kind of get bigger. It just doesn't happen until you hit that growth spurt and you get post-puberty and your body starts to produce more of these hormones that are going to aid in building muscle, like testosterone, growth hormone, those sorts of things. So hypertrophy shouldn't be a worry for any of you that are watching this that are younger. And again, we're talking again anywhere up to the age of like between 12 and 14. It does vary massively between people, but again, don't focus on it too much. But obviously I'm going to explain it as best I can anyway. Hypertrophy itself then can be broken into two areas. So you've got sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Again, sounds like a big word, sounds a little bit scary, but all that means is the cells in your body get bigger without an increase in the amount of force that they can produce. So you might look bigger, but the capabilities of that muscle to produce force against, we'll say, a dumbbell or a barbell or anything, there's no change in those. The other one then is myofibrillar hypertrophy, just about managed to say that, and that is when the muscle cells obviously get bigger and there's an associated strength increase with those. And that one's the most important one for us, especially for those athletes who are in that post-puberty stage, because obviously you want to build strength, and if you get an associated increase in size with that as well, then fantastic. Okay, so taking a break from looking at my face for a while, what you see here is an example of a long-term athletic development model. Not concrete by any means in explaining how we should go about developing youth athletes, but a useful model all the same, and relatively easy to understand once it's explained properly. A couple of things need to be noted here. The size of the writing dictates that specific components' importance at that time, from smallest to biggest. The bigger it is, the more important it is, and the smaller it is, the less important it is. While the ages have cutoff points, these are very loose. There is so much individual variation between these that I don't want you to get bogged down in individual ages. So if you see 12, it may be 12 for one person, it may be 13 for another, and it may be 11 for another. Across the top we have chronological age, which is your age in years. Next is the different age periods: early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence and adulthood. After that comes the growth rates and maturation status. These two are interlinked. You'll notice in the maturation and status section, PHV or peak height velocity is in the middle, and it coincides with the adolescent growth spurt. Peak height velocity is the period of time where you experience your largest rate of growth. This is usually followed approximately 6 months later by your largest rate of weight gain or peak weight velocity. You'll notice that moving into adulthood that you are still growing, but the rate at which you do so has started to decline. The training adaptation section is an important one for youth athletes to fully grasp. It's broken into two sections: neural adaptations, one that occur in the brain and the spinal cord level, and hormonal adaptations. In the early years of training, the majority of the adaptations that occur are due to neural mechanisms. The ability of the brain to recruit muscle fibers during exercise is improved, the number of muscle fibers being recruited is increased, the strength of the connection between the brain, neurons and specific muscle fibers is increased. These are just some of the adaptations that occur independently of an increase in muscle fiber size, hypertrophy and other factors. A lot of youth athletes think that they are going to get bigger straight away after starting the gym, but that is simply not the case, unfortunately. You will get stronger, but you may not necessarily get bigger, at least not until you reach your adolescent growth spurt. A lot of these adaptations will occur in the prepubertal period, which is why I'm such a fan of getting youth athletes into an unstructured S&C program as early as possible. If you can put the solid foundations in earlier on, it makes training at a later age a whole lot easier. The second part of that is the hormonal adaptations. This is due to an increase in the secretion of hormones such as testosterone and growth hormone. These peak around the time of puberty, hence why we see a huge increase in height around this time. If training is structured appropriately and technique is prioritized, then hypertrophy gains will be seen here. It's massively important for you as a youth athlete to understand this concept. There is no point focusing on hypertrophy when you're not ready for it. Some people hit puberty early and are lucky enough to benefit from this type of training much earlier, but don't panic, don't rush the training process and focus on the long game. Hopefully that helps you see the long-term development of a youth athlete is a lot more complicated than just prescribing exercise sets and reps. There are a lot more considerations to make, some of which I haven't even mentioned yet, but we'll get into the nuts and bolts of them further down the line. Moving on to some more basic phrases then, and one of them is volume. Now research suggests that volume is a key indicator of hypertrophy, and it is an arbitrary number that gives you a rough idea of the total amount of work done in a session. Gives us an idea of how well prepared our athletes are, how our training is going, can we push it a little bit more, do we need to pull back on it, and it's a key variable that needs to be steadily progressed over weeks and months as you progress through a training program to get the adaptations that you want. To calculate volume, you'll need two things. You'll need total amount of reps done and total weight lifted, and what you're going to do is you're going to take the weight lifted and you're going to multiply that by the total amount of reps done, and you get yourself an arbitrary number in kilos. So for example, if you did 2 sets of 10 with 100 kilos, that's 20 reps, that's 200, or 20 reps by 10 kilos is 200 kilos, so you've done 200 kilos of work. Now in the next week's session you want to do 250 kilos of work. It makes it a little bit easier then for you to add on, we'll say, do you add on reps, do you add on weight, but ultimately you're increasing the amount of work done by kind of like manipulating the volume. And sometimes you might get to a point where the volume of training is too high, and then you have to do one of two things. You need to scale back on the volume, or you increase your frequency. Now frequency is the amount of times that you go and you train every week. So for example, if you see a training program and it says 2 times per week, then your frequency is twice per week, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, whatever way it is. And ideally, as you start to get more advanced, you want to be training each muscle group or each movement at least twice a week. So for example, you want to try and squat twice a week, try and hinge twice a week, lunge twice a week, some variation of that movement. but I'll get into those movements in the next video, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. As far as terminology goes, they're pretty much the basic foundations of what you need to follow on the rest of the series. If there's one that you're not quite sure of, or you need questions on anything or answers on anything, drop them in the comments box and I'll get to them. There are obviously many more, but some of them will kind of pop up as we move on in the series. Hopefully now you feel a little bit more enlightened and more aware of things that are being said in a gym environment or throughout videos and stuff like that. Hope you enjoyed it, and catch me in the next video.